Hey there everyone, and welcome to another week of RPG Horror Story Cringe with DnD Doge. In today's episode, we have a tale about a dungeon master learning a very important lesson, a story about a game master targeting a player and taking things way too far, and more. So, without further ado, let's get into these stories. The Kobold Calamity, a cautionary tale of how the DM's impatience to play derailed a 3-year campaign. By Reddit user Fathomless Seer. I've been sitting on this story for a while, but after reading and listening to so many other terrible tales, I thought I'd give this a shot. In comparison to many posts here, this is a minor horror, but still worth relaying in my mind. Most of us here have heard of many problem DMs, problem players, and everything in between. But one thing I haven't seen much is how simple scheduling conflicts can lead to a disaster within a group of well-meaning friends because of a refusal to postpone sessions. To be fair, my failure to firmly disallow PvP played just as much of a role in what transpired. This story happened in summer of 2019. I was going through a tough time personally, and my homebrew 5e campaign was the main thing I looked forward to week to week. As a result, I was extremely reluctant to cancel even a single session. This was the seed of the entire mess that followed. The relevant players in this tale are DM, me, and the recipient of a valuable lesson. Escher, an extremely chaotic human bard who never met a cult that he didn't love, and the main actor in this drama. April, a half-elf great old one warlock, usually played by my sister, though not during the time frame of this story. Maxdrill, a half-orc cleric and the moral compass of the party, recently became the chief of the remnants of his former orc clan. This will be important later. Escher was always an interesting player to handle. In addition to his player's predilection for playing the chaotic neutral alignment to the hilt, he had to miss large swaths of the campaign due to other commitments. To make up for this, he and I would occasionally have solo sessions, self-contained side quests, backstory exploration, a new perspective on recent plot lines, that kind of thing. Fairly harmless, right? Well, during the last of these solo sessions, Escher's meanderings led him deep into the lair of a group of fanatical kobold cultists known as the Venomsworn, a location that Escher just so happened to share with April, my sister's half-elf warlock character. Now, my sister was abroad at the time, but her character was busy leveraging previous connections to infiltrate the Venomsworn on behalf of the party. This led to an impromptu reunion between two characters who detested each other, with only one of their players present. Note that their rivalry was entirely in-game. Both players were and are perfectly friendly in real life. How best to handle this situation? Even as a newish DM, I had several options. I could have rearranged things behind the scenes so that these two player characters did not meet, paused the plotline until my sister was back and available to play out her next steps, or do what I actually did, which was allow Escher to challenge April to a duel for the leadership of the Venomsworn. PvP with only one of the involved players present. What could possibly go wrong? To say Escher was unoptimized was an understatement. His swashbuckling character fit the campaign's world to a T, but a great warrior he was not. April, on the other hand, had superb stats, max HP for her level, and dice luck that Asmodeus himself would envy. What would be the harm in running her as a DM NPC and inflicting a non-lethal defeat on Escher? Well, one save or luck spell, and a natural one later, I was given a firm answer to that question. April was incapacitated, and Escher stood victorious. As the new leader of the Venomsworn, his first command was to order April fed to some nearby crocodiles. This, at least, I had the basic common sense to not allow, but April was nonetheless led away in chains to immediately escape off-screen. Escher's next steps caught me even more off guard. He marshaled the now subservient Venomsworn into an army with which to attack the Orc clan recently taken over by Maxdrill, the party's cleric. To this day, his players' motives for this are somewhat unclear to me. Unlike with April, there was no bad blood between Escher and the good-natured Maxdrill. Well, not yet, at any rate. Regardless, Escher would not budge. He wanted the orcs out of their pirate crew, and now he had the means to accomplish this. As before, I could have flatly disallowed this action as disruptive to the game. Instead, I allowed this course of action to proceed based on the input of one novice player who had perhaps, just maybe, not fully thought through the consequences of his actions. This led to an army of kobolds marching on the rest of the party and their allies, intent on bloodshed. Not ideal, but not unsalvageable so far, as no lasting damage was done to the absent April. The following session, the rest of the players could talk things out and diffuse the situation with Escher, who clarified that he meant his fellow player characters no harm. The following session rolls around, and lo and behold, Escher's player had a scheduling conflict. His character stood at the head of an army that was pointed at his companions. Surely, the session could not go ahead, right? We could play a one-shot, a side story, a board game, or literally anything else besides the main game. Well, no, of course not. I was naive, obstinate, and desperate to see the next step in the story of my first homebrew. So we went ahead and played out this session without either Escher's or April's player. Much NPC blood was spilt, bonds were broken, and absent players were left thoroughly baffled when they finally returned. It was an undeniable low point for this 3-year campaign, and in the end, both players missed an important beat in their individual character arcs. Escher was replaced with a new character entirely due to the mistrust between him and the rest of the party, though this ended up being temporary. Many smaller decisions had led us to this point, and I had made the wrong choices without fail every time. This should be obvious, but to my fellow DMs, do not do this. Communicate with your players, all of your players. Exercise your veto over non-agreed to PvP or any other choices that could rob agency or enjoyment from anyone absent from your table. And above all, don't let your impatience for table time ruin the stories and the relationships that you value most, like I nearly did. Wow, that seemed like a cluster and a half to deal with. Normally, this is where I would say where things went wrong and how things could have been done differently, but OP basically laid out all that stuff already. It's one thing to have players be controlled by the DM for a session or two, but it's a whole other thing to do it during pivotal moments in the narrative. Sometimes it's just better to postpone. So yeah, if you're a DM, learn from OP's mistakes and do not do those things. Let's move on. And a quick heads up, this next story has a brief mention of SA, so if you would like to skip it, go to this timecode here or use the chapters feature. But with that warning out of the way, let's get into it. DM disfigured and violated my character for seemingly no reason. By Reddit user Derrican93. I have been debating whether or not to post this story, but here I am. I will try to get as many details as I can, but this happened a few years ago, so it might be a bit fuzzy. This was a Pathfinder 1st edition game. The party consisted of a dwarf, who we'll call Dwarf. I can't remember his class, but that's not really relevant. We had a human anti-paladin, that we'll just call anti-paladin, myself playing an elf magus, and my wife, who's one of the players most relevant to the story, playing a Tengu rogue that was obsessed with shiny things. This will be important later. I will call her wife because, well, she was my wife. And lastly, the GM's girlfriend, who I think was a catfolk rogue, so we'll call her Rogue. This was the second campaign I had played with this group, with the exception of the anti-paladin, who was first joining on this campaign. Me, the GM, and Dwarf go way back and have been friends since middle school. This is the worst horror story involving this group, but definitely not the last. I think I have enough for a couple more posts. Anyways, we were all gathered around waiting to start, and I was talking to Dwarf about how excited I was to play the Magus, thinking of all the interesting high damage combos I could do with his spell combat. This is also important for later. Dwarf then warned me that his character was racist towards elves. I didn't think anything of it because I knew he was a good player and would do it in an interesting and appropriate way. Then we start. We describe our characters and are starting off in a tavern, and almost right away, the first red flag shows up. The dwarf player then states that he's going to walk past me and give me a light shove, saying, "Out of the way, elf," or something to that nature. This wouldn't be an issue if the GM didn't take this opportunity to make the dwarf roll for it for some reason. The dwarf then rolled a natural 20, causing the GM to decide that the dwarf's little harmless shove suddenly put me through a wall. He then made me roll to see if I was knocked out, and of course, I failed. Then the anti-paladin saw me and stole my money, which the GM allowed. I struggled, of course, throughout the rest of the session because I had no money. I don't really care too much about player-on-player stuff, if it's authentic to what the player characters would do and makes sense. Not the toxic "it's what my character would do" excuse for bad behavior, but an actual honest attempt at what their characters would do. In another session, my wife is very distracted by my shiny chain shirt and attempts to take it, but fails, so I jokingly call her a woodpecker. This apparently offends my wife's character, so she told the GM that she hired some thugs to beat me up. I don't really agree with this behavior, but it could have been an interesting side quest or something like that, if the GM didn't instead decide to take things way too far. We were at the tavern later that night, and I can't remember why, but I somehow learned out of game that the GM was going to make me drink a spiked drink. He tried to get me to drink it, and I explained that my intelligence-based magus wouldn't drink or do anything else that would alter his state of mind like that. And then he accused me of metagaming. I wasn't, but there was hardly any chance for me to roleplay to showcase that, so I was screwed. So, I drank it, and of course, I start to be affected. But because of earlier hijinks, I had no room to go to, and the dwarf hated me so much that he wouldn't let me sleep in his room, and everyone else just said no. So I had no choice but to go outside, and I was of course attacked and kidnapped. I was already annoyed at all of this, but it got much worse. The GM decided to bring in a character from his previous campaign, which in itself made no sense. But this character had a thing for elves, and that's where it goes very downhill. He has this character rape me anally and cut off my ear. Jesus Christ! I managed my way back and tried my best to roleplay through it, and the rogue, for once, decided to be nice to me and made me a hat to cover up my missing ear so I would look more normal. Though, not even 5 minutes later, she chimes in with, "I decide that's not what my character would do, so I take your hat back." The GM then says that she put something shining on the hat so that my wife would steal it. My wife never agreed to this, but it happened anyway. At this point, I've had enough, and I ask to talk to the GM privately, and we go to another room. I basically ask him why he was treating me like this, and his response was that he viewed my excitement for my character in the beginning as being cocky, and I apparently needed to be knocked down a peg. I demanded the opportunity to get the revenge for my character, and he agreed. I got what I wanted, and got a chance to fight him, only he made the character a way higher level than me. Of course, I failed a ton of the rolls, and he ended up killing me. The game ended shortly after that, and the anti-paladin ended up running the next campaign, which is a whole other horror story if you guys want. I can post that too. So, this GM targeted OP just because he was excited for the game, and thought that he was being cocky? You would think that a GM would be happy about one of their players being hyped for the game, but it sounds like the GM took the dwarf slightly shoving OP's character as an opportunity to start this trend of punishment, and it just kept rolling downhill from there, to a point that is just vile and disgusting. It's at that point that you should just stop the game and call out the GM, and tell him that he's taking things way too far. Then, when the GM told OP the reason they did it, I would have just left, after promptly calling that GM a few choice words. Whew, I think we need a kitty palate cleanser after that story. That's a bit better. Now, let's get into today's final story. Organize a kill team narrative campaign and get mocked, disrespected, and disgusted by a new player. By Reddit user, Very Bad. The story starts when I organized a Warhammer kill team narrative campaign at my university's tabletop club. I found a good amount of people, and surprisingly, most of them actually knew a bit about the game, so it made things go smoothly. There was this one new player, who I'll call Andrew. Andrew was completely new to the game, so naturally, I let him use one of my teams. A few things about Andrew. He obviously does not take care of himself. His hair is incredibly greasy, he smells a bit, and for some reason, he burps a lot. Now, while he's a little gross, I can easily ignore this kind of stuff. Playing tabletop games means that you're just going to have to put up with that kind of stuff occasionally. The first day of the campaign goes smoothly, and everyone has a good time. The second time we meet up, because of circumstances, only half of the people can make it. I'm already a little put down because of this, but whatever, this stuff happens all the time. So there's only me, Andrew, and 2 other players. While we were waiting to see if more people come, another player brought some food, so we begin to snack on it. I haven't been around Andrew much, so it's a shock when he begins to eat with his mouth open, loudly. I've never met someone who eats with their mouth open to such an exaggerated extent. It's so loud that no one can have a conversation because it would have overpowered it. It was so bad that no one could look at him as he disgustingly masticated on his food. Maybe it's how I was raised, but I consider eating with your mouth open unacceptable behavior in public. But regardless of how uncomfortable it made me feel, I carried on. While we were still waiting, Andrew picks up my printed document for my homebrew rules and begins to read through them. As he is reading the rules I wrote in a single night to prepare for this campaign, he begins to openly laugh and mock them. He begins calling out how things are underwhelming, poorly designed, OP, or underpowered. I'm not someone who's against constructive criticism, but this was not it. I felt completely embarrassed and humiliated. I wasn't going to pretend like what I wrote was a masterclass of homebrew design, but it felt terrible to be mocked in that way. It felt especially bad to be disrespected, as I was the one who organized the whole thing and created all the rules. Finally, after half an hour and no one else showing up, we play. Of course, I'm paired up with Andrew, and as Andrew is new, I let him borrow a simple but strong team. On the other hand, I'm playing a team that is considered to be underpowered, and as we begin to play, he quickly begins to win, and at every turn is gloating and laughing as he beats me. On top of everything else, he is not careful at all with my own models and terrain. He knocks large pieces of terrain over constantly, fumbles around with my models, and nearly loses several smaller components. Perhaps I'm nitpicking at this point, but every slight hurt. At a certain point, I just retreated into my happy place and ignored him. And I probably won't continue the campaign after this, and I will never interact with him again. TLDR, a rude player publicly mocks my homebrew rules, disrespects my stuff, and is just gross. Jesus, and I thought the bad hygiene was bad enough, but then the exaggerated eating, and then the straight up rudeness of laughing at homebrew rules for a game that he was apparently new to. Then the mishandling of your property. At that point, I would just kick him out, tell him to get a shower as he smells like a dead rat's butthole, and to learn some table etiquette when it comes to handling other people's things. Plus his eating. You shouldn't have to stop the whole game just because of one player. Though, those are just my thoughts. What do you think? But that will do it for today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.